The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler, February 21st, St. Robert Southwell. One of the dogmas of literary criticism is that poets should be studied in relation to their time, their occupations, and their general historical framework. However, it is often useful to study the writer in the light of his own writings alone. In any case, Robert Southwell is an exception, for before being a poet he was a man, a priest, a missionary, and a martyr. He was born around 1561 in Horsham St. Faith in Norfolk. His mother was a relative of the Shelleys of Sussex, so that a distant kinship linked Southwell with the great poet Shelley. Robert studied in Douai, where he was a disciple of the famous Leonardo Lessio, and there he first came into contact with the Society of Jesus. He continued his studies in Paris under the direction of Thomas Derbyshire, who had been Archdeacon of Essex in the time of Mary Stuart. Shortly after his 17th birthday, Robert asked to be admitted to the Society of Jesus. Admission was denied him because of his youth. This setback moved him to write the first of his poems that has come down to us. In the autumn of 1578, he was finally admitted to the novitiate in Rome. Later, he was prefect of studies at the Venerable English College and received priestly ordination in 1584. 2 years later, he left for the English mission in the company of Father Henry Garnet. Father Southwell's active missionary career lasted 6 years. In 1587, he was chaplain to the Countess Anne of Arundel in London, and this brought him into contact with Blessed Philip Howard, the Countess's husband, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Although he took every possible precaution not to make himself known, his fame soon spread, and his calm and kindly spirit gave effective impetus to his apostolic work. The Blessed stayed away from all political and ecclesiastical intrigues and controversies, devoting himself completely to his priestly duties. In 1592, denounced by a young woman from the house in which he had taken refuge, he was arrested by the infamous Topcliffe and locked up in Uxendon Hall, the house of his captor. In order to extort from him denunciations about other Catholics, the executioners subjected Blessed Robert to terrible torments on at least 9 occasions in Topcliffe's own house. Topcliffe had told the Queen, "Southwell is the most useful prisoner we have captured, provided we know how to use him." After almost 3 years of imprisonment in Gatehouse and in the Tower of London, the Blessed appealed to Lord Cecil, demanding that he proceed to trial or be released. The appeal took effect, for Blessed was tried and sentenced to death for the crime of being a priest. On February 21st, 1595, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. The torture was so cruel that those present cried out for the quartering not to be carried out, but after death. The Blessed was but 33 years old. Such, in short, was the life of Robert Southwell, but a brief study of his writings will allow us to add some details about his character and the events of his life. As indicated above, the first of his writings that has come down to us is a prose poem about his impressions when he was refused admission to the Society of Jesus. Foley in Records of the English Province, S.J., says that Robert wavered for some time between the Society of Jesus and the Charterhouse. This fact is not unimportant if we think of the differences between these two modes of religious life. When he was temporarily denied admission to the Society of Jesus, he wrote, "Alas, where am I and where will I go? I am a wandering pilgrim in an anguished desert. Strangers cannot enjoy the favors of privileged souls who have free access to the antechamber of the King. They alone partake of the spiritual delights of paradise and rest on the bed of a love that surpasses all delights." Many of the Blessed's writings from the time of his novitiate are preserved, and in them we find the echo of the sufferings, occupations, and joys of a member of the Society of Jesus. How great must be your love of God! Since you possess the privilege of belonging to the Society of Jesus, how grateful you should be for it. How high is the perfection demanded of a member of the Society, that he should be ready to set out immediately to any part of the world and to live among any class of men, whether heretics, Turks, pagans, or barbarians. It is therefore necessary to reflect on the virtues necessary to live among the Indians. The Jesuit must be prepared to be a prisoner of heretics, to face hunger, thirst, and all temptations, the rack and any torment. He must know how to live with the enemy, without losing sight of him, to enter constantly into combat, and never give in, or let himself be defeated. It would be difficult to express better the attitude of a Jesuit missionary. Southwell learned the lesson of obedience well, made it a personal attitude, and knew how to teach it to others by example and word. He also learned the lesson of humility. Remember that the rule commands you to esteem everyone as if they were your superiors and to strive to see in everyone the image of God. Blessed Robert seems to have foreseen very early on that his life would end in martyrdom. He was certainly aware of the living conditions of his Jesuit confreres in England and elsewhere, as news of their trials and sufferings constantly reached Rome. The Blessed learned of the execution of Edmund Campion, the first Jesuit martyr, and probably had the opportunity to read an eyewitness account of that martyrdom. The reading must not have been particularly pleasant for one who knew that he would soon find himself in exactly the same dangers. However, the letter that Southwell wrote to Father Persons for this purpose lets us guess, under the guise of a commercial communication, a note of jubilation. Campion has beaten you to it by loading his ship with English goods and has already reached the desired port. Every day we expect to hear the same from you. In his letter to Father Aquaviva, General of the Society, written in 1586 from Calais when he left for England, Blessed Robert expressed his desire to die a martyr's death without hiding the fears of human frailty. I think less of the tortures than of the crown that awaits me, but the flesh is weak and resists the idea of martyrdom. Southwell was not an impatient adventurer embarking on an exciting and promising expedition, nor a saint of cheap hagiography assisted by choirs of angels. He was simply a man of flesh and blood, ready to renounce even life itself for the love of God. Although fear and anguish made themselves felt from time to time, his will remained firm because he placed his hope not in his own strength, but in the grace of God. John Gerard's autobiography gives us an idea of the life of a Jesuit missionary in England in the 16th century, a bitter existence of intense work and struggle, of travel, disguises, and clandestine meetings, a life of constant flight until the moment of capture finally arrived, followed by torture or a new flight. After enduring such a turbulent life, Father Southwell was appointed chaplain to Lady Arundel. There he wrote his two most important prose works, Mary Magdalene's Funeral Tears and Epistle of Comfort, both intended to encourage and comfort Catholics. We do not know the date when Father Southwell wrote his poems. Since he had more free time during his time as Lady Arundel's chaplain, and especially when he was in prison, we can assume that he wrote them during those periods. Although in the case of the Blessed, the poet is of less importance than the priest and the missionary, this does not mean that poetry ceased to constitute a very real part of his existence. His short, elegant lyric poems, so intense and passionate, reveal the qualities of his spirit in an unobtrusive and often moving way. And nothing can bring out those qualities more than the study of the life in which they were realized and expressed. The poems of the Blessed reflect most vividly his courage and sensitivity, his faith in God and in the beauty of creation, even in the midst of the worst brutalities of the time, the strange contrast of that holy and gentle man forced to flee from the law, hiding and disguising himself as if he were a criminal. They also reflect his severe asceticism and his devotion to an almost military discipline necessary to carry out his missionary work, his renunciation of all the pleasures of the world, born not from a morbid desire to punish nature, but from an irresistible yearning to sacrifice everything to obtain the pearl of great price. It is the eternal Christian paradox of having nothing and possessing everything. And that paradox of Christian truth was Southwell's source of inspiration. In New Prince, New Pomp, the poet tells us of the value system introduced by the new prince, whose cradle was a stable. In Lauda Sion Salvatorum, he translates with great skill, in a very difficult verse form, the hymn of St. Thomas Aquinas, with all its emphasis on the apparent contradiction between faith and the senses, reason, and revelation. Southwell's temperament was admirably gifted to sense the apparent contradiction hidden beneath the apparent simplicity of Christian dogma, as well as the tension between these two elements with all the depth of its meaning, its richness of interpretation, and the complementary truths to which it gives rise. It is natural that Blessed Robert should have written in the popular form of his time, since apart from other reasons that may have existed, the conceptual style of the late 16th century lent itself especially well to expressing the paradoxes of faith and the feelings they provoked in the poet. I live, but my life is constant death. I die, but my death is life without end. My death-life is a negation of my life-death, and the life that awaits me will crown my mortal life. Robert Southwell has been compared to Sir Philip Sidney because of the general tone and the taste of both for conceptual style. There is nothing strange in this, for Sidney exercised a profound influence on the younger poets of his day, but the similarity also extends to the intensity and warmth of feeling of both poets, although the differences are even more interesting and revealing than the similarity. Sidney is the prototype of the gentleman of his time, while Southwell was a persecuted Jesuit, hated and accused of treason. Despite this, Sidney and Southwell would have understood each other well because both were cultured, sensitive, peaceful, and of great integrity. As Father Garnet puts it, our dear Father Southwell was prudent, pious, kind, and of great personal attractiveness. And elsewhere, what an extraordinary and beloved man Father Southwell was. Blessed Robert's poetry is generally short, compact, and very intense, well crafted and constructed, but not too polished or overdone. Happy phrases abound, emerging from the labyrinth of words and ideas. However, his best poems are not the most complicated. For example, the famous Burning Babe is of a moderate conceptualism that allows the reader to easily follow the idea. The most poignant of his poems, The Virgin Mary to Christ on the Cross, is simple and straightforward, and the few puns it contains are not puzzling. Robert Southwell was a lyric poet. His emotion, energy, and passion, governed by a severe discipline imposed by both his vocation and his will, naturally sought concise expression in a few lines full of meaning and feeling. This makes his two longer works less interesting. We refer to Fourfold Meditation on the Four Last Things, the authenticity of which is doubtful, and St. Peter's Complaint. But whatever their value from a poetic point of view, the important thing is that his poems show us once again what the poet's interests were: the bitterness of the four last realities of human life, the way in which God's love was wounded by sin, God's desire for man to repent, and what awaits the unrepentant. In the preface to his poems, Southwell laments that so many of his contemporaries profane the divine gift of poetry, employing it for base things, and states his intention to use the poetry and style of his time to catch his contemporaries in their own snare. This makes us understand that the dedication with which the Blessed devoted himself to the study of his language during the years of Rome had no other object than to fight the enemy with his own weapons. And Robert Southwell's style was an excellent weapon, since while profane poetry created labyrinths of words and concepts simply as a game of wit, the conceptualism of sacred poetry, without losing any of its value, became a means of expressing the deepest religious truths, both because of the paradoxical character of Christianity and because of Southwell's ability to express its truths. The poems of the Blessed were very popular, for their form, if not their content, was in keeping with the taste of the times. On the other hand, Catholics found in them a true spiritual reading, expressed in terms to which they were more accustomed than we are. The Blessed found the exact formulation of what life was for the Catholics of that time: a zigzagging race towards a debatable repose, a labyrinth of innumerable paths. The fragility of human happiness and the vanity of pleasures about which Southwell wrote were for Catholics a daily experience. Therefore, they needed the Blessed to comfort them with his triumphal songs about heaven, God's mercy and love, the spiritual joy to be found in suffering, and with his translations of the Church's hymns and reflections on the life of the Savior. If the Blessed did not translate the hymns of the resurrection, it was precisely because his attention was focused on the life, sufferings, and death of Jesus Christ, of which his own life and that of all English Catholics were a pale reflection. Love does not understand the rules of reason, but those of love. It sees neither what can be done nor what ought to be done, but only what it wishes to do. Difficulties do not daunt it, and impossibility does not stop it. These words of the Blessed in Mary Magdalene's funeral. Tears express perfectly the attitude in which he lived and died, as well as the attitude of his poetry, in which the audacity of his faith and the sharpness of his intelligence avoid the pitfall of turning lyrical beauty into loveless fanaticism. Roberto Southwell does not advise us not to look for mouse flowers, but to look for them in heaven.